Hey everybody, welcome back into the EscapePod for an EscapeBite. I'm Julie.
I'm Charity.
And we're trying something new. We're going to add a little to what people hear from us on a week-to-week basis. And if you are a child of the 80s, like I am, you know McGruff, the crime dog, was always taking a bite out of crime. We thought we could take a little bite into crime in smaller doses. So you're going to catch these mini episodes, like I said, about once a week. And the first topic was one...
And Julie's writing them, so we're doing a role reversal.
It is a little bit of a role reversal.
The writing for these. And so I get to just kind of buckle in and see what comes.
You can sit back and relax a little bit, but I'm doing...
Kind of a weird feeling being the control freak that I am. So
right. You'll be okay.
This is a new experience.
You'll be all right. You're going to learn something today.
Yeah, I'm excited.
It's actually really a follow-up to something that we touched on in one of our regular episodes just a few weeks ago. And we talked a little bit in a case that you were featuring about somebody who wanted to plead insanity. Mm-hmm. And I think the judge didn't accept that the person was insane, so it was kind of a regular court case. And I said, you know, it is really rare. And you asked if I'd ever been in a court case where, as a reporter, where somebody successfully made that plea. And I could really only think of one time where mental health in the case of a female defendant was really at the center of the case for a while. And ultimately, though, the case proceeded. But I had to go back and look at I was hoping to find some of my old stories, but the TV station where I worked has since merged with another station. Right. And so those old stories that were on the internet for years, I could not find, much to my dismay, because I'm like, that would have been really easy. Right. And I just needed some refresher. So a lot of this information I did find courtesy of a friend of mine who was a reporter at the local newspaper, and she really covered a lot of the case from start to finish too. And so just highlighting this a little bit. So in this case, you know, insane to the common person, I can't stress enough, is not necessarily insane in a court of law. Yeah. And so when I went back through this case, I remembered a lot about kind of how things went down. But we're going back to the mid-2000s or 20-aughts, as the kids like to say these days. I don't know if that's true. But it was the case, the victim in the case was a young man named Troy Klug. And he was 26 years old from right here in Rapid City. He was last seen alive on July 12th of 2004. Uh-oh. He went to the home of a woman named Cynthia Kindle to buy methamphetamine. He had a drug problem. The obituaries list his death as July 15th, 2004, so 3 days after he went missing, although at that point...
They didn't really know?
There was no body.
Okay.
No body, no murder charges. But prosecutors had good reason, I think, because of the testimony of people kind of involved in this circle.
Was she known to law enforcement too?
I don't know about her previous history, but we will talk about her history. Okay. I don't know about her history in court at this point. But they had good reason to believe that Troy Klug was dead and that he was killed because of an unpaid drug debt.
Uh-oh.
So let's talk briefly about the defendants in the case. At least 5 people faced criminal charges in Troy Klug's disappearance. Eventually, some of them were charged in connection with his murder as well. Kind of the point person, if you will, kind of the main character in this was Tory Tiegen. Tiegen was convicted of kidnapping Troy Klug in 2005, and he was sentenced to 100 years in prison for kidnapping because there was still no body.
Wow.
Yep. Cynthia Kindle was named as a co-defendant, okay? Initially, she was found incompetent to stand trial. She spent a year at the Human Services Center, also known as the State Mental Hospital. And in September 2006, so again, a year later, a judge ruled that Cynthia Kindle was competent to stand trial and set her trial date for January of 2007.
Okay.
Instead, Ms. Kendall pleaded guilty but mentally ill in January of 2007 and was sentenced at that point to 20 years in prison. Not the same day she pleaded, but shortly thereafter. From the State versus Tiegen in a 2008 appeal, so when Tory Tiegen appealed his case, this is part of what was included in the notes from that. Kindle was found incompetent to stand trial by the circuit court. Although Kindle had a history of brain injury and mental illness, nothing in the circuit court's findings declaring Kindle incompetent to stand trial would suggest that she was insane at the time she conspired with the defendant. Indeed, Kindle's sanity at the time she entered into the criminal agreement with defendant to kidnap Klug has not been raised. So this argument on the part of the state was basically saying, you know, the defendant in this appeal is saying, well, you allowed testimony from somebody who at the time was considered incompetent. So between 2004 and when she was deemed competent in 2006, that they allowed some of that testimony into Tori Tiegen's case, and it was partly considered in what...
Is that why they reversed it?
They didn't reverse it.
But if she was, if I heard you right, the testimony was she was claimed to be incompetent and then later ruled, no, you are competent to stand trial. But isn't that a reversal?
That's a reversal for her.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So she was later ruled to be competent, but at the time she was actually initially charged, she was not.
So because they're using her testimony in his case, that's why I'm asking, is that why they reversed it?
No.
Okay.
Nope.
I could see how that would impact his case, though, if it's like, well, she's incompetent and now
Correct. But they're saying no. And this is why they say, so to add to what the argument was, incompetency to stand trial and incapacity to commit a crime because of insanity are, of course, distinct and separate issues. And that came from State versus Jones and also State versus Rough Surface. So in the state's argument of the appeal, they're basically saying just because she was deemed incompetent at some point during this case doesn't mean she was insane when the crime was committed.
Okay. That's their distinction.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So fast forward in 2009, so we're several years after the case, Tori Tiegen pleaded guilty to felony murder and finally told authorities where Klug's body was buried.
Now, tell me again how old all these people are.
They were pretty much all in their 20s, except for Cynthia Kindle. She was in her 40s, early 40s.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Cynthia Kindle's defense attorney really provided some insight into her background. So he stated to the effect that her actions must be viewed, quote, through a prism of mental illness, compounded by drug use. So I mentioned my friend who is a reporter, Heidi Bill-Giese.
Oh, Heidi.
Yes, she was wonderful. Was a Rapid City Journal reporter at the time and covered this case really from start to finish. And she reported that when Cynthia Kindle admitted in court to her role and pleaded guilty but mentally ill to Klug's kidnapping, her account of the incident was that she left home after Klug arrived, returning to find Tiegen had bound Klug with duct tape. She saw others punch Klug as he lay in the car trunk and later saw him dead in a garage. Now, people's accounts of the kidnapping and subsequent assault and murder varied over the years, depending on who is testifying and when they testified.
How many witnesses were there?
Numerous.
Really?
But 5 people were ultimately charged.
So they were making
some
a
of those
display
cases,
of this situation of this kid.
Some of these individuals testified against other defendants. And so one of the
what a mess.
Later reports that I found mentioned the fact that, Tori Tiegen finally gave an account because for years he just...
What did he say happened then?
So one of the things
Does it give a more
said,
complete picture?
Well, it's his account though. So in one case, one of the other women who was charged, not Cynthia Kindle, he basically said she didn't know. She really had very little to do with his death. And people wondered if the prosecution is like, are you saying that because she's one of the only people who didn't testify against you? So they, in many of these cases.
It's hard to tell.
Right. And I would just say they tended to downplay their role. Whatever that role was, it was a lot of finger pointing. That person did this, that I was there, but I didn't do. There was kind of that throughout this case.
But at no point was there, I was there and this was batshit and we needed to report this.
Oh, never.
Yeah,
oh, no.
Well,
they were.
That's called culpability.
Right. And ingrained in a
Implicit,
drug
yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they were just embedded in a
And
drug
you also
culture.
don't rat out your
Correct.
people. Yeah.
So Kendall's attorney
Get stitches.
called
Or
it one
worse.
of the most difficult cases of his career, both for the awfulness of the crime and because of the complexity of his client, citing a history of mental problems, including diagnoses of bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress
And
disorder,
that was kind of
and
before
anxiety
bipolar was
disorder.
really well understood, right?
Probably
It was
to some
just
extent.
kind of, yeah.
He said that her marriage had ended in the mid-90s and her life just fell apart. She moved to Washington State and began using drugs at that point. He also mentioned that she'd been a victim of assault in 1999 and then returned to South Dakota, where she did seek help from various doctors for her mental illness. By 2004, her lifestyle was, quote, a disaster waiting to happen, and the disaster happened, he said. She met Tori Tiegen. So according to the South Dakota Department of Corrections website, Cynthia Kendall was discharged from their custody in September of 2019.
Okay.
So she did serve
Yeah.
her time.
Yeah.
But that was the case of sitting in a courtroom with her. I think probably what ultimately killed him was that he was beaten. But he was also held in July for a while in a toolbox on the back of a truck.
Oh my
so you
God,
know those
in the
big
heat?
Yeah.
It gets really hot here in July.
Yep. So
he could have suffocated.
one way or another, he was bound. He had duct tape over his mouth, but he was also beaten at different intervals through the period of this kidnapping. And it was a pretty heartbreaking case. And I do still remember, they just believed, they were certain that he was dead. I think they probably had testimony from somebody who said they knew that the body was taken someplace.
Where had they dumped it then?
So they ended up burying it in a very rural part of southeast Montana, very close to the South Dakota line.
Okay.
And that is ultimately the fact that 5 years later, this person who had been heavy into the drug culture could take them back to the same spot was pretty interesting to me. But they did end up finding the body with Tori Tiegen's help. And if I recall correctly, it basically was he made a deal. If I tell you where, you're not going to seek the death penalty. And it was closure for the family. And that was important at the time. And I think for prosecutors, too, I remember getting a call from one of the people who worked on the case, and he just said, we had something happen. This is in 2009, years later. We've had something come up. You're going to want to keep an eye on, it was probably the fax machine, to be honest. Like, there's going to be an announcement coming.
Okay.
And I knew, I'm like,
Fax machines. Oh my
they know where he is after all these years. 5 years passed before they found him.
Can you imagine being his parents or his family?
Nope, not at all. But again, just kind of an interesting take. And I think, too, unfortunately, like, she had a lot of trauma in her life. And that's where the drug use probably started as a coping mechanism, but it got in deep. And again, it was her home that he went to. That was the last place several people saw him alive. And ultimately, he was likely killed in the Belfouche area, and then from there taken to a rural spot in Montana to be buried. But it would have been probably minimum a day of torture.
I just think, like, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm a drug dealer for a minute. And I have unpaid debts.
Yeah.
The likelihood I'm going to get paid if I beat to death one of my clients,
Sure.
guess what, is zero. I'm not going to get paid. And there's all of this downside of, guess what? Somebody some point's going to find something. Mm-hmm. It's going to point back to me at some point. I'm clearly not a genius because I'm engaging in the lifestyle I'm engaging in. So I'm not going to get away with this. I just don't get it.
Not sure.
Like you don't sell to them anymore and you keep, I'm sure bullying, intimidating, and hope that
Right.
you get your money. You don't give them any more drugs,
Yeah.
or you give them a way to work it off, or you do something, but you kill them, you beat them to death. What does that,
I'm
is
not
that a
sure
message
that
for the
they
next person?
thought- I don't know that they went into it thinking we're going to kill him.
Drug fugue. It kind of reminds me of that Samantha Wolford case. Do you remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
It's just they were all in this meth-induced fugue and
I think that's fair. I
Not-
think that's fair.
yeah, they might have been getting the dopamine, but they sure were not getting
Right.
intelligent.
So just
Well
a little
thought
brief update, and yeah, it doesn't have a happy ending, but it does speak to the fact of, again, insanity. What you and I think is insane doesn't always play that way.
I think it takes
court
a
of law.
lot.
It takes a lot.
Yeah.
It takes a lot, and I think in cases where somebody is deemed insane or never ends up standing trial because they're never deemed competent to do so. Those are, most of us would be like, yep, that's fair. It's those kind of like teetering ones, right? Where you go, But again, just like the one citing of the appeal, just because you have a moment now where at some point you were considered incompetent doesn't mean that you were
always
insane when the crime was committed. Doesn't mean you didn't know right from wrong. Doesn't mean you didn't realize that if we keep beating this person, if he's held in this space in the heat, that
Oh my God,
he's going to live.
terrible way to go.
Yeah, it was.
You can't
it
even
was
breathe through your mouth.
Heart-wrenching. Yeah. It was heart-wrenching. And I will add that in her sentencing, because the defendant did speak, Cynthia Kendall, and she did express remorse. And so, again, she did go to prison. She went to prison for many years. And then the DOC reports discharging her in September of 2019.
Well, thank you, Julie. That was our first EscapeBite. I don't know if we really escaped. I'm kind of feeling down now.
I know. I'm sorry.
Jeez, now I know what you feel like every freaking week.
Sometimes I think back on those court cases, and in some cases I remember really clearly things, and other times I'm
well,
like,
it's getting it's a lot of distance now. I do that all the time.
20 plus.
But then when you get those little catalysts, like yeah, there it is, and the floodgates open.
And I will say I have the highest of respect for, she isn't a reporter anymore, but she was a fantastic reporter. So my friend Heidi,
Thanks,
formerly
Heidi.
of the Rapid City Journal, I know I was like, I'm a little embarrassed I have to go to other media sources other than my own. But, that was one thing. I had packages and packages of notebooks that were filled over the course of time. At that time, cameras were not allowed in a South Dakota courtroom. And I think even now it's sometimes they will be, but it's very, very rare.
Limited, yeah.
And so you really are taking notes frantically. And those notebooks have been long gone. So anyway. For more.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody. We decided to do something a little bit different and just give you a little midweek tidbit in case you save them up for when you only have a couple minutes to listen instead of, our normal 45-minute to an hour format. But we're grateful. We just wanted to give you more content, something to fuel your weeks and hopefully educate you along the way.
Yeah. Go to escapepod.live. You can be a patron there.
Yeah.
You can
link out to socials.
You can do all the things. I'm trying to think of the word subscribe.
You
can subscribe so you auto-download. And
tell us how we did. I mean, this is something new we're trying. If you like it, let us know. If you don't like it, let us know. I mean, we'll keep trying new things.
Write in to just because at escapepod.live.
Yeah, maybe you have an idea for a future EscapeBite or a full-length episode. Either one. We would love the tips. Sometimes it does get hard to find content.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's like I start digging and it's like, there's 27 things here. How am I going to pick? Sometimes it just flows. Sometimes it's pulling teeth. So we would love for you to contribute, make this podcast yours, in that way on shaping the content.
Yeah. We're going to close the hatch on this little mini-sode. We'll be back. See you again next time.
Bye, everybody.